the thing I want to speak with you about this morning centers around a word that's used in the Bible. If we look at the Greek word that is translated by our English word that I want to talk with you about, that Greek word, you look up what that Greek word means, it literally meant whisperer. So what might we be talking about if the Greek word for it means whisperer? Pardon? Gossip, exactly. This is a topic that always needs some reminding about, I think, everywhere because of our tendencies sometimes. Do people ever come to you with gossip, whether it's church, work, neighborhood? Do people ever come to you with gossip? Did you hear what so-and-so did? What so-and-so said? Maybe a more important question is when you've heard something, when you've seen something that is a little, do you ever go around and say, did you hear what? Do you ever do that? Well, I want us to think about that this morning. Turn with me to Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1. This is where Paul is describing the pagan Roman society and how far they had gone from God and goodness and righteousness and gone into just degenerate things. And Paul writes in Romans chapter 1, beginning in verse 28, there's plenty before we get to 28 about the terrible things they were doing. But starting from verse 28, and just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things which are not proper, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. I wouldn't want those people living next door to me, would you? They lived all around the New Testament Christians, and honestly, they live all around us today. And these are, we may think sometimes of gossip as one of those little things that maybe it's not quite right. But I mean, look at the things it's grouped with. As Paul describes how degenerate Roman society had become. And so we get to the end of verse 29, and Paul throws gossip right into that same mix. The next word he mentions in verse 30, as he begins verse 30, is slanderers. So I want to talk about the difference between those two things for just a moment. Slander is when you say something false about someone. Say something false. Gossip is different than that. That's why there's two different things listed here. There's gossip and then there's slander. Slander is when you say something false about someone. Gossip doesn't matter whether it's true or false. So the problem with gossip is not, oh, it was a lie, they didn't do that. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not. And sometimes, as we think about something that we've decided to talk about, tell about, we think, well, it's what they did. It doesn't matter if it's true. It can still be gossip and something to be avoided. The second passage I want us to look at, 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 20. Paul, we're very familiar with 1 Corinthians, all the problems that existed in the church in Corinth, and all the things Paul had to rebuke them for, straighten them out about, exhort them, stop doing those things. when we get to Second Corinthians, it appears they fixed some of those things. But on the other hand, there's some things they had not fixed. And there were some in the church in Corinth. That is a large part of what Paul writes about in Second Corinthians. Is there are some there in the church who are saying you shouldn't listen to Paul. Paul's not a real apostle. Some of them were even saying we are apostles. Don't listen to Paul, listen to us. And those people were not being dealt with as they should have been. And so Paul, he's on his way to visit Corinth when he writes Second Corinthians. He's just up in Macedonia, just north of there, and he's going to come down to Corinth right after he sends them this letter. And so he says in verse 20, "For I'm afraid that perhaps when I come, I may find you to be not what I wish, that I may be found by you to be not what you wish." And Paul's not worried about who he is or what he is. He's just worried that they want him to be something different than he is and that he ought to be. So again, if you start in verse 20, "I'm afraid that perhaps when I come, I may find you to be not what I wish. I may be found by you to be not what you wish. That perhaps there may be strife, jealousy, angry tempers, disputes, slanders, gossip, arrogance, disturbances. I'm afraid that when I come again, my God may humiliate me before you, and I may mourn over many of those who have sinned in the past and not repented of the impurity, immorality, and sensuality which they have practiced." When Paul says at the beginning of verse 21, "I'm afraid God will humiliate me," what he means by that is that God wants him to go to Corinth. God's bringing him to Corinth. But Paul's afraid that when he gets there, he's just going to feel humiliated because all his efforts in Corinth to get them to be the kind of people they ought to be will look like an utter failure. And one of the reasons that it would be an utter failure of these things that he mentions is that gossip might still be going on. So we get some a view of the seriousness of this problem and the wrong that it is. I mentioned a moment ago that just because a thing is true doesn't mean it's proper to mention. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, Paul doesn't mention gossip specifically in this passage, and I'm not sure he has it specifically even in mind, but he says in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 13, "And at the same time, they also learn to be idle, going from house to house." I was thinking of a different verse. He does mention gossip in this verse. As they go around from house to house, and not merely idle, but also gossip and busybodies, talking about things not proper to mention. Gossips and busybodies talking about things not proper to mention. Yeah, there are things that happen. There are things that people do. There are things that people say that might upset someone. It might not even be wrong what they said or did, but it might upset this other person. Or maybe what they said or did was kind of out of line. But that doesn't mean it's proper to talk about. It's not proper to mention, Paul says. We need to think about those things. Back in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, the passage we just read a moment ago, Paul characterizes gossip as sin, impurity, immorality, sensuality. So no wonder that we whisper it. If you have something good and beautiful to say about somebody, you're not trying to do it. But when we gossip, there's something in us that I don't want everybody to know that I repeated this thing to you. And so we whisper it. And so that's why the Greek word for gossip is literally a whisperer. Because we know that it's not proper to mention. We know it's not proper to talk about. And yet sometimes we do. sometimes our rationale is, well, I'm just going to tell one person. I'm not going to go around through the whole church telling everybody about this thing that so-and-so said or so-and-so did, but I just have to tell, my best friend about this. I just, maybe one more besides that. The problem with that is those two people also have friends, and they hear it, and they say, well, I'm not going to spread this around, but I'm just going to tell Bob here. I start thinking real quick, is there Bob here? I don't know. But we think, I'm just going to tell one person, but that's what starts the spread of something that should never have been spread before the eyes and ears of a whole group of people. And so when things come out that should never have come out and somebody ends up crushed because a private matter of theirs got repeated before everybody, then that one person who was the first to go around telling about it, well, it's not my fault. I just told one person. Yes, it's your fault. You shouldn't have started that. That's gossip. If there's no helpful purpose, then why talk about somebody? Now, there can be a helpful purpose in discussing something that somebody did. We'll talk about that here in just a moment. But if there's no helpful purpose to your repeating things that are not proper to mention, then why talk about somebody? What's the motivation to talk about something that you don't have a place talking about? Gossip is a bad thing. The fact that it's true makes no difference. Let's turn back to the book of Proverbs and see some things about why gossip is harmful. Proverbs chapter 17, verse 9. Whether it's true or false information. Proverbs chapter 17, verse 9. He who covers a transgression seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates close friends. Somebody does something that they shouldn't have done. If you cover that, you're seeking love. But if you go broadcasting that with no real good purpose, you're separating close friends. I remember one time, this was years ago, there was a lady in the congregation. We were good friends. We talked a lot. We were good friends. And then one day, a younger person, I was kind of young at the time, but a little bit even younger person told me, you know what Kathy said about you? What? What did Kathy say about me? And I don't even remember what it was. It wasn't anything terrible, but it hurt my feelings. I remember it kind of hurt me that she would, number one, think that. Number two, say it to somebody else. My argument right now is not against her, because it really wasn't a big deal. My argument is against the third person who came to me and said, you know what so-and-so said about you? Because I was close friends with her. And for at least a couple of weeks, that really bugged me and bothered me. That's what this verse is talking about here in Proverbs chapter 17, verse 9. He who repeats a matter separates close friends. Now, we got past that, and it wasn't a big deal, but sometimes it can be a really big deal and very hurtful. Proverbs chapter 26, as we've looked at that verse in Proverbs 17, we learned that if we seek love between brethren, we shouldn't go around spreading things like that. Proverbs chapter 26 is talking about situations where there's already some conflict going on. And, everybody wants that conflict to calm down and let's get past this conflict and let's work out whatever negative feelings we have about someone and what they've done. And so Proverbs chapter 26 is talking about that situation. Proverbs chapter 26, beginning in verse 20. For lack of wood, the fire goes out. Now, we generally think of a fire as a good thing, and you don't want it to go out. You know, you have a campfire, you have a fire in the fireplace, whatever it is, you don't want it to go out. But this is talking about a situation where you want the fire to go out. You know, I remember when I burned my hand up a few years ago. Wanted that fire out. And so the proverb says, for lack of wood, the fire goes out. Yeah, just quit putting more wood on that. It'll go out. But then you have the fella who comes along and chunks another log in the fire of this conflict that's going on. And it was maybe getting to the point that, okay, we're about past this, and feelings are still raw a little bit, but we're kind of getting past it. And then somebody says, well, I remember when he blah blah blah. And yeah, I remember that too. And all of a sudden, the fire is roaring again. For lack of wood, the fire goes out, and when there is no whisperer, contention quiets down. Like charcoal to hot embers and wood to fire, so is a contentious man to kindle strife. In my translation, I don't have the word gossip here, but I have the word whisperer. Where there is no whisperer, contention quiets down. Like charcoal to hot embers and wood to fire, so is a contentious man to kindle strife. So, when there's already a conflict and we're trying to calm things down, we're trying to get everybody back on the same page again, don't be that person who comes in with another bit of information and gossip, something that's not useful or helpful. Sometimes it's something that needs to be brought up, and it is something that can help the situation. But when it's not useful and helpful, don't be that person to lob another chunk of wood onto the fire of that conflict among people. Don't gossip. Well, what about hearing gossip? We've been talking so far mostly about being the one to spread gossip. What about when somebody comes to you with gossip? Verse 22 here in this same passage. The words of a whisperer are like dainty morsels. I don't generally talk about food I eat as dainty morsels. Something really juicy. Somebody comes to you with something really juicy. And you're inclined, there's something within us that's inclined to hear what they have to say. The words of a whisperer are like dainty morsels, and they go down into the innermost parts of the body. Like an earthen vessel overlaid with silver dross are burning lips and a wicked heart. He who disguises it with his lips, but he lays up deceit in his heart. We'll stop there. There's, some evil pleasure we have in hearing something that somebody did or somebody said. That dainty morsel. But what should we do when somebody comes to us with something that, if we're evaluating our own actions, we should realize, I probably shouldn't go around repeating that. If I should do anything, it's go to the person that I'm offended by and just talk to them about that problem. I shouldn't go around telling others about it because it separates friends and it keeps conflict going. So when somebody comes to me with that kind of information, what should I do? Listen to it? No. What you should do is stop them and say, wait a minute, stop. I get a sense for where you're going with what you're going to tell me. And is it really anything that's my business? Is that information that I can do anything with? Or is this information that you should just, one, keep quiet about, or two, you go to that person and try to resolve whatever it is you're upset with them about? Why am I being brought into this? You see, listening to gossip is just the other half of the problem. Half the problem is spreading the gossip, but the other half of the problem is being the person willing to entertain it and listen to it. So stop it in its tracks when it comes to you. Say, no, that's not my business. You shouldn't be telling me about that. You should ask yourself, do I really need to know this? If the answer is no, then don't get me involved in it. All right. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that we would talk, and I'm turning to Matthew chapter 18, that we would talk about for a few minutes here the fact that sometimes there is reason to tell something about another person. And I would not consider this gossip. Sometimes it's the thing that needs to be done. Matthew chapter 18 is the first reason I see that and think that. Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 and following. And if your brother sins, go and reprove him in private. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. Somebody does something wrong. Don't go over there, tell somebody else about it. You go to that person. Because why should I be spreading this to even more people? We'll just try to resolve it where the problem is. Go to him in private and reprove him. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. See that last phrase? You have won your brother. That's your goal. Your goal is not, oh, I'm going to stir up everybody about what he did. Your goal is you want to win your brother, be everybody on the same page. Now, sometimes they have sinned, and you've gone to them as you should, and you said, hey, we need to talk about this. You did whatever it was. You said whatever it was. And I don't feel like that was right. And, I'm operating from this passage over here that says, we shouldn't do that. And I'm wondering if you'll talk to me about your thoughts about why you did that and if you feel like that was the right thing to do. And hopefully they will say, either immediately or after some length of discussion or a week later, you're right, and I'm sorry I did that, and I hope you'll forgive me. Hopefully that's the way it works out. And I've known plenty of times when it does work out that way. But sometimes the person will not respond positively. And so continuing in this passage, verse 16, but if he does not listen to you, take one or two more with you, so that by the mouth of two or three witnesses every fact may be confirmed. So yeah, there's a point when you've tried to resolve it the best way and the most private way, but the person didn't respond and he still remains convinced that his sinful act was okay and that he's not to be blamed for it. So then, yeah, you need to start bringing in the whole congregation immediately. You know what it? No. You're still trying to keep it as private and small as possible. So you just bring one or two others with you and talk with the person about that problem. You see, you're trying not to spread this, even though it was flat out sin, you're trying not to spread this to everybody so that everybody looks at them and says, you did what? Trying to keep it small. So one or two others, if you won't listen to you, one or two others, take them with you. Have a little group discussion about that thing. Sometimes that resolves the situation. Sometimes it doesn't. And so Jesus continues in this passage. And if he refuses to listen to them, then tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax gatherer. But all too often, we're willing to treat them as a tax gatherer and a Gentile upon being the first person to hear about the thing they did. No, that's when you go and talk with them and win your brother back. But if he refuses to listen, refuses to hear, refuses to change, then yeah, you have to get to that point. But the lesson here in this passage, at least the lesson for our lesson today, is you're trying to keep it private. You're trying to preserve unity. You're trying not to spread this unnecessarily. And so you have some reason to talk to somebody else about it. You bring the one or two with you, but it's in an effort to get that person to do what's right. It's not just in an effort to pointlessly, uselessly, know what they do. 2 Timothy chapter 4. Sometimes it is right to give a widespread warning about somebody and the things they have done. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 14 and 15. Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. Be on guard against him yourself, for he vigorously opposed our teaching. First of all, it seems like Alexander was being kind of out in the open about his opposition. He was vigorously opposing Paul's teaching. And he had done Paul a lot of harm. And Paul was not out to get Alexander himself. Paul is not out to just hurt Alexander by making this announcement about Alexander the coppersmith, because the Lord will repay him. I'm not worried about revenge or hurting him like he hurt me. The Lord will take care of that. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. But there are situations like this where others need to be aware of the evil that person is doing. And so Paul tells Timothy, be on guard against him, for he vigorously opposed our teaching. Sometimes a person is doing harm, and others need to be warned about that person. When it's a proven troublemaker, sometimes other people need to be warned about that. A proven troublemaker who will not change. A few years ago, there was somebody in the church who was acting to my face like we were friends, everything was fine. And I didn't know this at first, but behind my back, he was going around to other people and talking really down about me in really bad ways. And one of my other friends that he would talk to about me came and told me, hey, you know, he's acting to you like he's your friend, and he's acting to you like everything's okay, but it's not. And he's saying things like this about you. I appreciated knowing that, because I had one view of how the friendship at that point was between me and this person, but that was a false understanding and a false view. And I needed to know that that wasn't what I thought it was. That time went by, and we're on good terms now. I'm glad about that. But that was a time there was a troublemaker, and that person came to me and gave me a warning about that. And I think that fits in here with 2 Timothy chapter 4, when there's a proven troublemaker, sometimes others need to be warned about that. One other example, Philippians chapter 4. We talk about and we think about when somebody mentions your name in a negative light in front of other people. How would you like it if some preacher that had a lot of influence with this congregation had helped this congregation, and he sends a letter to this congregation with a lot of good stuff in it, encouraging things in it, and in the middle of that letter he says, oh, by the way, you and whoever need to get your act together and get along instead of having this conflict, and he names you. And if that's in a letter that goes down as part of the Bible for the rest of the time, your name in there. Paul did that in Philippians chapter 4. Philippians chapter 4, verse 1. Therefore, my beloved brethren, whom I long to see, my joy and my crown, so stand firm in the Lord, my beloved. I urge Euodia and I urge Syntyche to live in harmony in the Lord. Indeed, true comrade, I ask you also to help these women who have shared my struggle in the cause of the gospel, together with Clement also, and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. Paul does call out these two people. Paul isn't relishing how bad they are, simply stating a fact here with the sincere desire for them learning to live in harmony with each other, to get along with each other. And he encourages some of the others in the congregation there, help these two women get along as they ought to. Another thing I want to say, and it's connected to this, that Paul isn't saying this in some bitter, hurtful way. He's saying it to be helpful. When someone has done something or said something that upsets you, I think it's right that you might seek counsel about how to deal with that person. They said this, it's hurtful, harmful. They did this thing that wasn't right. I realize I shouldn't just go around gossiping about them, and I'm not going to do that. And what I should do is talk with them about it. I'm not sure how to talk with them about that. And so you might ask some counsel, you might ask some advice from somebody else in the congregation about how to go about that. So when you go to seek counsel from someone, realize you don't have to tell that someone every last detail of what that person said and did. Give them a basic sense of what the problem is without going into all the harmful, hurtful details. But also, a good question for you to ask yourself when you go to talk with someone else about this person is, what is your motive for going to this person? Is it really to just get some good, solid advice about how to go to this person? Or is it something more sinister? Is it just the urge to gossip? And a good measure of that is, who is it that you go talk to? Is it your best friend that you share everything with? Or is it instead somebody you really respect, their leadership and wisdom? If it's gossip, you're probably not going to go to that person whose leadership and wisdom you respect, are you? Because you realize that they're going to recognize this is outright gossip. But if it's your best friend, it might be something you enjoy. How do we enjoy that? But sometimes we do. You might enjoy talking about it. Now, sometimes your best friend is also going to be that person whose wisdom and experience you admire. And so that's fine. But ask yourself that question. Am I going to just somebody that I enjoy talking to, or am I going to somebody who I think has the best shot at giving me solid advice on helping this person? All right. I'm going to close with just some rules of thumb here that we glean from these passages we've looked at. You know something about this person over here. Whatever you do about that, there should be within your heart this sense that I don't want to violate their trust. I know about it. Maybe they even told me, I'm the one they told about it, but I don't want to violate their trust if I don't have to. That's one thing. Number two, I don't want to harm relationships. I want to help heal relationships. Is me talking to this person going to be really helpful in healing this problem, or is it just going to be more harm done? More harm done, that's gossip. And I don't want to make bad situations worse. I want to make bad situations better. So think about those things as you're thinking about, do I have any role talking to somebody else about this? I don't want to violate people's trust. I don't want to harm relationships. I don't want to make bad situations worse. Motive is really important here. You'd rather keep things private, but sometimes help is needed. All right, I'm going to close with 1 Corinthians 14, verse 26. 1 Corinthians 14, verse 26. What's the outcome then, brethren? When you assemble, each one has a psalm, has a teaching, has a revelation, has a tongue, has an interpretation. Let all things be done for edification. Now, this passage, this whole chapter is talking about things that we do when we assemble together. So it's really a more limited kind of scenario this chapter is talking about than life in general. But that last line there is so good for governing our lives every day of the week. Let all things be done for edification, building up. That's what edification means. For building up, not for tearing down, for building up. Let all things be done for edification. Our Lord is great, and He wants us to be great too. He wants us to come to Him, learn to govern ourselves like Him, learn to live like Him. And if you know that you've not been living like Him, you know you've done things that you maybe need prayers for. Maybe you've done things publicly that you need to let everybody know that you regret those things. Maybe you need to come to Christ because